Resident Evil 4 Remake released, and the game is amazing. Yeah. Capcom's recent track record with the Resident Evil series has been near spotless, with banger after banger entries since RE7, and we're always looking forward to what else they have up their sleeve for future games ahead. So you'll have to forgive us when we give in to some casual speculation to what else could be on that zombie-ridden horizon. Hey you busy bees, this is your host Bina, and in the spirit of imagination, let's talk about what the next mainline Resident Evil game could be all about in this video. Zombies and survival horror are synonymous with Resident Evil, but that didn't stop Capcom from trying something different every time with each RE game. Horror branches out into different and distinct genres, much more if you go into the specifics with subgenres, and Resident Evil has shown to infect any and all kinds with each installment in the series. Now what is all the talk about subgenres? Well, it'll be a useful tool that can help us look at the series as a whole, and maybe, just maybe, predict where the future of the series will be. For now it may not make some sense, but trust us, it will pay off. We can divide the current Resident Evil games into these three groups and compare them with the different horror subgenres: Resident Evil 1 to 3, zombie horror, and survival. The first three Resident Evil games fall under the survival horror and zombie type of horror, with heavy emphasis on managing your resources while being put in a precarious situation with little to no control over anything. RE1 embodied the cabin in the woods horror tropes, while RE2 amped it up by switching from the tension-filled Spencer mansion to the chaos among the streets of Raccoon City. RE2 introduced the constantly chasing tyrant with Mr. X. So RE3 ran and burst through the wall with that idea with Nemesis, more or less suiting the slasher subgenre of horror, being a constantly looming threat that you have no idea when or where he'll pop out next. Resident Evil 4 to 6, bioterrorism and action. Resident Evil shifted to a mix of both action and horror as we approach Resident Evil 4 through 6. RE4 being a prime example of occult horror with the Ganados and their worship of Los Plagas, while 5 heavily focused on the dangers of bioterrorism. RE6 then released the zombie horde worldwide, making it almost like a disaster movie. This is also the start of the series moving away for more traditional portrayals of a zombie, and even giving new monsters a chance at fighting players. While it could be said that this group of games barely fit the genre of horror, you could say that it still highlights the dangers of using bioweapons, more so than before, and the backdoor shady deals and politicking that can come out of it. Resident Evil 7 to 8, a change of scenery. Now Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, which we'll just call RE8, reinvigorated the series by taking a surprisingly fresh approach. Instead of applying horror tropes to a Resident Evil game, they flipped the script and applied RE tropes into a horror genre of their choosing. Both RE7 and 8 set a new trajectory and are a prime example of Capcom's willingness to experiment with the Resident Evil series. RE7 exchanged the extravagant mansions and underground high-tech labs for the rural swamps and the dilapidated Baker Ranch, with heavy emphasis on the dirty and backwoods aesthetic with a touch of the paranormal. It really dove headfirst into the grindhouse and splatter subgenres. Meanwhile, RE8 then went to a completely opposite direction, from hot and musty Louisiana to a cold, snowy Eastern European village in Romania. Now exploring the subgenre of gothic horror with vampires, werewolves, and an overall Victorian-era horror vibe. Think Castlevania, but less popped-up colors and a much hotter tall vampire villain.
Mother!
Yeah. Now we laid out the foundations of what Resident Evil tries to embody with each game, the fun stuff begins. What could RE9 possibly do next? Looking back at the reveal trailer for Resident Evil 7, remember that almost no one thought it was a Resident Evil game until the title dropped.
Resident Evil 7.
But Capcom took the giant risk of redefining the series again while still keeping true to its roots. And it paid off, changing the question from what a Resident Evil game should be to what a Resident Evil game could be. With that in mind, no idea is too absurd or too impossible when it comes to coming up with what can happen in the next mainline sequel. We have to think like Capcom, push the envelope like Capcom, and with the established pattern of different and distinct horror subgenres being the driving force, like in RE7 and 8, we can try to predict what it can be about. Imagine if Rosemary Winters from the DLC continues her saga on trying to control her powers. What would a game like that look like? Cosmic horror. It was explored a bit in the Shadows of Rose DLC that Rose's powers affected her mentality as well. While the ending of the DLC sees her finally gaining full control, what if at some point it takes over her again and this time, it can't be stopped. Without anyone else under the control of the Megamycete to confront Rose, whatever haunts her now may be an indescribable horror beyond anyone's imagination. RE9 in this subgenre can go as gruesome as, let's say, The Evil Within, or as brutalist and ambiguous as Remedy's Control, or maybe return for another trip to Europe, this time diving more onto the less glamorous side of Victorian design like Bloodborne. Either way, the exciting thing about cosmic horror is that it can come in any form. Its only prerequisite is that whatever is coming to get Rose may be something that is beyond human cognition and comprehension. When putting the fear of a people's god in someone else isn't enough, the fear of the incomprehensible will. Ooh, don't you love that chill creeping up your spine? Is this what you guys feel when you're scared to the bone? I love it. Oh, apologies. Lost my thought processing there. Asian folk horror. The RE series tends to lean on Western interpretations of horror as well as depictions of its monsters. But what if RE now turns its undead eyes eastward and even delve deep into the deep well that is Eastern folklore? Has Chris Redfield plot a course to the BSAA's European headquarters? But what if Rose changes course and goes to China or Japan, India or Indonesia? They can really play up Rose's fish out of water situation much more in this scenario. Imagine reports of mythical creatures of old have spiked, and it's Rose's job to figure it out. Imagine Resident Evil's take on the Japanese kappa, or the chimera-like Lumbuswana of Indonesian folklore. Capcom can really stretch legs with their monster designs, and can become a particular standout compared to RE7 and 8 in terms of utilizing a unique subgenre. That is a wholly different take on the genre as a whole. Occult detective horror a la detective noir style. Now what if we mix completely different genres for the next game as well? Picture this. Years after the Shadows of Rose DLC, Rose takes up the role of a special agent or detective that specializes in bioterrorism, and she takes a case that seems to dig into the paranormal. Like RE4, Rose will have to face against some occult fanatics that seem to be behind whatever mystery she's been brought into, with many twists and turns along the way. Figuring out who her real friends or foes are, mixing both RE1 to 3's elaborate puzzles with the gunplay of 4 to 6, the possibilities and how stylized the game can look. You can really go wild with this one, and it could still fit with the Resident Evil mold. You can even go better with the noir tropes, with Rose being cynical about the world, questioning what counts as a man or monster anymore, since she herself is both. But of course, it all ends with Rose blowing up the occult's evil residence and saves the world. Resident Evil still needs that cheese, of course. Space horror. In the eerie and scary isolation of deep space, Rose has grown up and become an aerospace engineer years after the previous game. They have learned that the study of mutated virus and other bioweapons are best kept at safety and isolation of space. Rose is now the head of her own space crew on their own ship because of her useful abilities granted by the Megamycete. Her crew receives a distress signal from the main research station on the moon. There seems to be some unknown entity from space that suddenly started killing and transforming the crew members into different creatures. As Rose tries to figure out what happened and how to escape the station, it turns out whatever is turning the people into vicious creatures are caused by undetectable spores coming from a man-made source. Without the help of Chris, the BSAA, or any other veteran of the series, it's up to Rose to endure the vacuum of space, along with the dead that now roam. Hey, wait a minute. This is just Dead Space, the game where its literal goal is to be Resident Evil, but in space. Well, drat. Gotta think of something else then. But the idea has potential. The mystery and dangers of space is something that Resident Evil can really toy with, and we have proof that it can be done and done well. What a horrifyingly good idea. Resident Evil, but in space. But actually, Resident Evil this time. I was even thinking that the game could end with a whole research station blowing up like usual with any RE game. Oh wait, Dead Space did that too. Damn it. It's not just horror genres that gives us some insight on what the next sequel could be about. The trend of designing the game's logo to highlight its chronological entry in the mainline series started with RE7, with alphanumeric 7 in Biohazard, and the Roman numeral for 8 in Village. Assuming this continues with RE9, it's possible that the next game may have the numeral 9 as part of the game's subtitle. This is where you can let your imagination run wild and coming up with titles that contain IX. Match this up with our earlier genre ideas and you can get a bunch of wild yet plausible designs for the sequel, like Resident Evil Helix, really emphasizing the role of Rose and her DNA given how she's a mold person. It can really fit the idea of a space horror focused RE9 as well. How about maybe if Ethan is actually alive, rising like a phoenix after that explosion? And Rose finds out by digging the archives and finding out that his death was a cover-up, like an occult detective noir one. I think this is our best yet. Now this one, completely original. The daughter of Ethan Winters, Rosemary Winters, has abilities and is inserted into the genes of the son of a mysterious bioweapons developer. That son's name is Jake Muller and has to work with him throughout the game, culminating with the entire cast of Resident Evil heroes teaming up for a last battle. Call it Resident Evil 6. And if we're really looking towards the past, let's go all out. We can have a modern Resident Evil game with all the new added elements, but the camera is fixed. Get it? It's called Resident Evil fixed camera. Humor is strange. And that's all that we can think of so far. That's got our minds racing and our hearts pumping on what could be the next for Resident Evil. While all these ideas might seem ridiculous and out of left field now, that didn't stop Capcom from reinventing the series twice. So at this point, anything and everything is within the realm of possibility. We know that what people call the chads from the Resident Evil teams will make it work, no matter how different the sequel can be. And with RE4 Remake being released of high quality, it's nothing but excitement and hype to look forward to with what's next for Resident Evil. And we're dying to see what they'll come up with next. Let us know what you think the sequel will be like and what it can be about down in the comments below. Like and subscribe so you don't miss out on new videos. This is your pal Bina from Game8 Information Station, logging off.